The candle in Edmund's study had burned low, but his eyes stayed fixed on the window. Below, in the moonlit courtyard, a figure moved quickly along the garden wall, wrapped in a dark shawl. It was Clara, the young woman who had joined his household only weeks ago. She glanced over her shoulder twice before slipping through the side gate and vanishing into the night. Edmund's pulse quickened. This was the fourth night this week she had disappeared like this, always after the household had gone quiet, always returning before dawn with tired eyes and no explanation. He had asked her once casually where she went. She had smiled politely and said she visited a sick relative, but something about her answer felt rehearsed, too smooth, too practiced. Edmund was a man who trusted facts, not feelings, and every fact before him pointed to a secret. A duke could not afford secrets under his own roof. He told himself this was about duty, about protecting his household and his name. Yet as he watched her disappear into the shadows, something else stirred in him too, something he refused to name. Without waking a single servant, Edmund pulled on a plain coat, one without the crest that marked him as nobility, and slipped out through the back door. The night air was cold and sharp. He kept his distance, staying close to the walls, moving only when she moved. Clara walked with purpose, her steps quick and certain, as though she had made this journey 100 times before. She never looked lost. She never hesitated at a corner. Whatever she was doing, she knew this path well. They passed through the quiet part of town where the great houses stood, then crossed into narrower streets where the buildings leaned closer together and the air smelled of smoke and rain. Edmund had never walked these streets before. In his whole life, he had never needed to. He felt strangely exposed without his title, without his usual guards, just a man following a woman he barely understood. Clara turned down an alley so narrow that Edmund had to slow his pace to avoid being seen. He pressed himself against a wall as she knocked twice on a wooden door. It opened almost instantly, as if someone had been waiting for her. A woman's voice, weak and trembling, greeted her from inside. Clara stepped through, and the door shut behind her. Edmund stood frozen in the alley, his mind racing through possibilities. A secret meeting, a hidden alliance, perhaps even a plot against his family. He had followed her expecting scandal, expecting betrayal, expecting to catch her in some act that would confirm his suspicion. But standing there in the cold, listening to muffled voices through a thin door, he realized he understood nothing about the woman who worked in his own home. He waited, his breath visible in the night air, debating whether to knock, to walk away, or to simply keep watching. Whatever answer lay behind that door, he knew his life was about to change in ways he could not yet predict. Edmund did not knock. He told himself it was caution, though a part of him knew it was fear of what he might learn. He stepped back into the shadows of the alley and waited, watching the dim light flicker beneath the door. Minutes passed, then almost an hour, and still Clara did not emerge. The cold crept into his coat, but he did not move. He had come too far to turn back now. When the door finally opened, Clara stepped out carrying an empty basket, the kind used for carrying food or medicine. She pulled her shawl tighter and turned down the alley in the opposite direction from where they had come. Edmund followed again, more careful this time, keeping a wider distance. She did not go home. Instead, she walked toward the edge of town, where the streets gave way to open fields and a scattering of small, worn cottages. He nearly lost her twice. Once, she paused at a well to speak briefly with an old man drawing water, and Edmund had to duck behind a low stone fence to avoid being seen. The second time, she cut through a narrow footpath between two cottages, and he found himself standing at a fork in the road with no sign of her at all. His heart sank. He had risked everything, sneaking out like a common thief in his own city, only to lose her in the dark. He walked further, scanning the shadows, listening for footsteps. The fields were quiet except for the wind moving through the tall grass. For a moment he wondered if he had imagined the entire pursuit, if his tired mind had built a mystery out of nothing. Then he heard it, faint but clear, a child's cough coming from a small cottage ahead, its window glowing with a weak, flickering light. Edmund approached slowly, staying low along the fence line. Through the window, he could see Clara kneeling beside a narrow bed, speaking softly to a child who looked pale and thin. An older woman stood nearby, wringing her hands, her face lined with worry. Clara reached into her basket and pulled out a small parcel wrapped in cloth, along with a folded cloth pouch that looked as though it held coins. He felt something shift inside him, a mixture of confusion and quiet alarm. This was not the secret meeting he had imagined, not a lover, not a conspirator, not a threat to his household. Yet the questions multiplied faster than the answers. Why would a housemaid have money to give away? Where did she find the time, night after night, to walk these long distances alone? And why had she never once mentioned any of this? Edmund stayed at the window longer than he intended, watching her tend to the child with a gentleness he had never seen her show inside his own halls. She checked the child's forehead, adjusted the blanket, and spoke words too soft for him to hear, though her expression told him everything. This was not duty. This was not obligation. This was someone who cared deeply, who had built a second life entirely hidden from the house she served in. As he turned to leave before she could catch him watching, his foot caught a loose stone, sending it skittering across the path with a sound far too loud for the quiet night. Inside the cottage, the voices stopped. Edmund froze, his heart pounding, realizing that his secret pursuit was about to collide with the very secret he had come to uncover. The cottage door opened before Edmund could retreat into the darkness. Clara stood in the doorway, her eyes narrowing as she peered into the night, searching for the source of the sound. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then her gaze found him, half hidden behind the fence, and her expression shifted from confusion to disbelief. She did not shout. She did not run. She simply stared at him, her jaw tight, as the truth settled between them. Edmund stepped out from the shadows, no longer able to pretend he was anywhere else. He opened his mouth to explain himself, but no words felt adequate for what he had just witnessed. Inside the cottage, the older woman called out, asking if everything was well. Clara answered without turning, her voice steady despite the tension on her face, assuring her that all was fine. She stepped outside and pulled the door partly closed behind her, putting distance between the sick child and the man who had followed her through half the city. Edmund finally found his voice. He admitted plainly that he had seen her leaving the house night after night and had grown concerned. He did not try to disguise his motives as noble. He told her the truth, that suspicion had driven him more than concern, and that he had followed her expecting to uncover something scandalous. Instead, he had found something else entirely. Clara's arms crossed over her chest, her eyes glistening with a mixture of anger and exhaustion. She explained that the woman inside was her aunt, and the child was her young cousin, orphaned after his parents had died from illness the previous winter. With no one else to care for them, Clara had taken on the burden herself, working extra hours and giving away nearly everything she earned to keep them fed, warm, and cared for. She had told no one in the household, fearing that revealing her circumstances would cost her the position she desperately needed. A duke's home was not a place for personal troubles, she said, her voice sharp with old frustration. Servants were expected to be efficient, invisible, and untroubled by lives outside these walls. Edmund listened without interrupting, feeling the weight of every assumption he had carried into this night. He had imagined betrayal and found devotion. He had expected scandal and found sacrifice. Standing in the cold with the truth finally exposed, he realized how little he had understood about the people who worked within his own home, people whose entire lives existed beyond what he ever bothered to notice. He apologized, plainly and without excuse, for following her and for doubting her intentions. Clara did not soften immediately. She reminded him that trust, once broken by suspicion, was not easily repaired, no matter how noble his title. Her words struck him harder than he expected, and for the first time in a long while, Edmund found himself uncertain of what to say next. The night air grew colder, and inside the cottage, the child coughed again. Clara glanced back toward the door, torn between the conversation and her responsibilities. Edmund realized this was not the moment for more words. It was the moment to prove through action that his understanding had truly changed. The days following that night felt different for Edmund, though he said little about what had happened. He watched Clara move through the household with the same quiet efficiency as before, but now he saw what lay beneath her composed exterior, the exhaustion she carried, the worry she hid so carefully behind polite smiles. He no longer saw a servant performing duties. He saw a woman carrying an entire family on her shoulders alone. He debated for days how to help without causing her further embarrassment. A direct offer of money, he suspected, would wound her pride and confirm her fear that he saw her as a charity case rather than a person deserving of respect. Instead, he made quiet arrangements. He spoke with the town physician and asked him to visit the child under the pretense of routine care for tenant families, a service that cost the family nothing. He arranged for a modest but steady supply of food to be delivered to the cottage, listed simply as surplus from the estate. Clara noticed within a week. She confronted him carefully, unsure whether to thank him or protest his interference. Edmund explained honestly that he wanted no credit and no gratitude. He simply could not, in good conscience, allow a child to suffer when help was so easily within his reach. He told her that what he had discovered that night had changed how he saw not only her, but everyone who worked within his walls, people whose struggles he had never thought to ask about. Slowly, the distance between them began to close. Their conversations, once limited to brief instructions and polite greetings, grew longer and more genuine. Clara spoke of her cousin's small improvements, of the aunt who worried too much, of a life she had never expected to share with anyone in the house, let alone the Duke himself. Edmund found himself listening more than speaking, learning things about resilience and quiet strength that no education had ever taught him. Months later, the child's health improved steadily, and the fear that had once lined Clara's face began to fade. She still worked within the household, but she no longer carried her burden entirely alone. Edmund made sure of that, not through grand gestures, but through small, steady acts of support that respected her dignity rather than diminishing it. What began as a night of suspicion, of a duke slipping quietly through the shadows to catch a hidden betrayal, had instead uncovered something far more valuable. Edmund had set out to protect his name and his household from scandal. Instead, he had discovered the depth of quiet courage that existed just beyond his own doorstep, hidden in plain sight the entire time. In the end, Clara remained in his household, though their bond had grown into something neither titles nor duties could easily define. Edmund often thought back to that cold night in the alley, the moment his assumptions had crumbled entirely. He had followed her in secret, expecting to find a scandal that would confirm his suspicions. Instead, he had found a truth about compassion, sacrifice, and the quiet strength of someone he had almost failed to truly see.